On Everest, the promise is simple and dangerous at the same time. No one left behind. It's a sentence spoken at base camp, repeated during training, believed, right up until the mountain decides otherwise. Above 26,000 feet, ideals begin to thin along with the air. Every breath becomes deliberate. Every step feels borrowed. And the rule that governs normal life, that stopping to help is always the right thing to do, starts to fracture under a colder law. If you stop too long, you may never move again. This is where Everest reveals its quiet contradiction. It is the most climbed 8,000-meter peak in the world, guided, mapped, and familiar. And yet, in the death zone, rescue remains largely an illusion. Helicopters cannot hover. Strength does not recover. Time does not slow down just because someone needs help. Climbers pass bodies here, some famous, some unnamed, not because they are cruel, but because the mountain has already made the decision for them. To kneel is to risk collapse. To stay is to gamble with oxygen, daylight, and judgment. This story is not about condemning those choices, nor excusing them. It's about understanding the moment when compassion collides with physics, and physics always wins. On Ben Stories, we don't chase summit photos or legends. We follow the decisions made when the summit no longer matters. Only survival does. Because on Everest, the hardest climb isn't up. It's the one you make inside yourself. When turning back means living with what you leave behind. Everest's death zone begins quietly, without ceremony. There is no line you cross, no warning sign in the snow. One moment you are climbing, managing fatigue, trusting your systems. The next, your body starts to fail in ways you cannot reverse. Above 8,000 meters, oxygen levels are so low that the human body is slowly dying even while moving. Muscles weaken, vision narrows, judgment dulls, sleep becomes useless, appetite disappears, and every decision, especially the decision to stop, comes with consequences measured not in minutes, but in survival. This is the environment where the unwritten code of Everest is enforced. From the outside, Everest appears organized. Fixed ropes, established camps, Sherpa teams moving ahead to prepare the route. But none of that changes the core reality at extreme altitude. There is no such thing as a traditional rescue. Helicopters cannot operate this high. Carrying another adult climber is nearly impossible. Even helping someone stand may drain strength you don't have. In 1996, this reality became visible to the world. During one of Everest's most infamous disasters, multiple climbers were caught high on the mountain as a sudden storm closed in. Some were disoriented. Some were out of oxygen. Some could no longer move on their own. Climbers passed one another in fading light, each struggling to survive. Among them was Yasuko Namba, a climber who collapsed near the south summit. Several climbers encountered her. Some stopped briefly. Some spoke to her. But as the storm intensified and oxygen dwindled, the calculation became brutally simple. Staying meant dying beside her. Namba did not survive. Later, those who descended carried more than frostbite and exhaustion. They carried questions that never fully went away. Could they have stayed longer? Could one more effort have changed the outcome? Or would it have only added another body to the mountain? These moments are often misunderstood. From a distance, they look like abandonment. Up close, they are triage without tools, performed by people whose own lives are already slipping. Sherpa climbers are part of this reality in ways rarely acknowledged. They move repeatedly through the death zone, fixing ropes, guiding clients, and assessing conditions. They are often expected to do more, carry more, risk more, because of their experience. But experience does not make oxygen appear. Sherpas face the same limits as everyone else, and sometimes heavier expectations. Another haunting example lies along the Northeast Ridge, where climbers pass the body known as green boots. For years, he lay beside the route, visible, unavoidable. Climbers did not stop because they could not. Not because they lacked humanity, but because stopping was a commitment their bodies could not afford. Everest does not ask whether a choice is moral. It asks whether it is possible. And when climbers reach the point where someone can no longer walk, can no longer clip into a rope, can no longer respond clearly, the mountain leaves them with only one honest question. If you stay, will anyone survive? There are no speeches in these moments, no dramatic gestures, just silence, shallow breathing, and the slow realization that ideals formed at sea level cannot survive at 29,000 feet. This is where the shift happens, when a team becomes individuals, when solidarity gives way to self-preservation, and when the mountain begins collecting its price. On Everest, tragedy rarely arrives suddenly. It builds decision by decision, until there are no good ones left. If the death zone weakens the body, it quietly dismantles the mind. At extreme altitude, climbers are not thinking the way they believe they are. Hypoxia narrows attention, memory fragments, emotions flatten. What feels like calm logic is often the absence of panic, not clarity. Experienced high-altitude doctors describe it simply. Above 8,000 meters, judgment degrades faster than people realize. This matters because the choice to help or to walk past is not made by a fully functional brain. During the 1996 Everest disaster, climbers later described moments that felt unreal. People sat down and refused to move, not because they were giving up, but because their brains could no longer process urgency. Others insisted they were fine while standing inches from collapse. Language became unreliable. Time lost meaning. In these conditions, determining whether someone can still be helped becomes dangerously uncertain. A climber may be conscious, but unable to coordinate their limbs. Another may speak clearly, yet lack the strength to stand. Some promise they can keep going, until they fall again moments later. Every pause drains oxygen. Every delay invites cold. And every attempt to help carries a hidden cost. The helper's own survival margin shrinking by the minute. Sherpa climbers encounter this dilemma constantly, often before anyone else. Moving ahead of teams, they are frequently the first to find a climber in trouble. Expectations, spoken or not, can be heavy. Sherpas are seen as stronger, more acclimatized, more capable of one more effort. But biology does not grant exceptions. Sherpas suffer hypoxia. They experience frostbite. They run out of oxygen. And when they are pushed beyond safe limits, the outcome is the same. The difference is that their decisions are often judged through a quieter lens, their sacrifices absorbed into the background of Everest's narrative. Veteran climbers have acknowledged this imbalance in recent years, but on the mountain itself, there is no time for reflection. Only assessment. Can this person stand on their own? Can they clip into the rope? Can they descend without being physically carried? If the answer is no, the situation has likely already passed the point of rescue. This is where the unwritten code becomes visible. It is not written down because no one wants to admit it exists, but climbers learn it quickly. Above a certain altitude, you cannot save someone who cannot save themselves, without becoming a casualty too. Survivors often describe a moment of hesitation, a few seconds where they stop, look back, and feel the weight of the decision settle in. That pause can be the most dangerous moment of all. Some turn back and do not return. Others continue downward, carrying an invisible burden that lasts far longer than the climb. Years later, many struggle to explain their actions, not because they don't understand them, but because language feels inadequate. How do you describe choosing life when the cost is another human being? Everest does not reward bravery in these moments. It rewards movement. It rewards efficiency. It rewards those who recognize, sometimes too late, that the mountain has already removed every alternative. And when climbers finally descend below the death zone, the physical danger fades, but the questions do not. They surface in quiet moments, in sleep, in ordinary life far from the mountain. Everest may release the body, but the mind carries the climb with it, long after the summit no longer matters. When climbers return from Everest, people often ask about the summit. Very few ask about the descent. But the descent is where most ethical fractures occur, and where they linger the longest. Survivors rarely describe their decisions with certainty. Instead, they recall details out of order. The sound of wind growing louder, the feel of gloves stiffening with ice, the moment they realized their oxygen was lower than expected. Somewhere inside that sequence is the decision to move on. In 2006, British climber David Sharp collapsed near the same area where Green Boots had once lain. Dozens of climbers passed through that section of the route that day. Some spoke to Sharp. Some assumed he was part of another team's rescue plan. Some were too impaired to fully understand his condition. He died alone in the death zone. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. Media coverage framed the story as moral collapse. How could so many people walk past a dying man? But climbers who had been there told a different story. They described exhaustion so deep it felt like detachment. Oxygen levels barely sufficient to keep themselves upright. A route crowded with people barely functioning, each one operating on the edge. What those stories revealed was not indifference, but diffusion of responsibility under extreme stress. In a place where no single person has the capacity to help, everyone assumes someone else might. By the time that assumption collapses, it is already too late. Sherpa climbers were drawn into the same scrutiny, despite the fact that many had already exceeded safe exposure limits that day. Some had made multiple trips through the death zone. Some had assisted other climbers earlier and were themselves deteriorating. Yet public judgment rarely accounted for cumulative fatigue or unequal risk. Inside the climbing community, the conversation was quieter and more complicated. Experienced climbers pointed to earlier failures, overcrowding, summit pressure, commercial schedules that compressed too many people into too little time. By the time Sharp was encountered, the real decisions had already been made hours earlier. This pattern repeats itself across Everest's history. The final abandonment moment becomes the focal point, while the chain of decisions leading up to it fades into the background. Psychologically, survivors often experience what experts call moral residue. Even when they intellectually accept that no rescue was possible, an emotional remainder persists, the sense that something fundamental was violated. Many describe feeling disconnected from ordinary life afterward, as if everyday moral rules suddenly feel fragile. Some climbers attempt to return to Everest to reclaim meaning from the mountain. Others never climb above 6,000 meters again. A few leave mountaineering entirely, not out of fear, but because they no longer trust the version of themselves the death zone revealed. Sherpa climbers face a different burden. Many return season after season, carrying memories they cannot afford to dwell on. The mountain is not a proving ground for them, it is work, responsibility, and livelihood. Their silence is often mistaken for resilience, when it is more accurately necessity. Over time, Everest reshapes how people understand heroism. The idea that bravery always means pushing forward begins to erode. What remains is something quieter. The courage to turn around early, to enforce limits, to accept that not every situation allows for moral purity. The mountain does not punish hesitation. It punishes delay. And when climbers look back on the moments that haunt them most, it is rarely the act of leaving. It is the moment they realized there was nothing left to do, and that realization arrived too late. Everest does not create villains. It exposes the cost of pretending limits don't exist. And for those who have stood in the death zone, that exposure never fully fades. In the years since these tragedies, Everest has tried to change, without ever truly softening. Routes are better managed. Weather forecasting is more precise. Oxygen systems are more reliable. Communication between camps is clearer than ever before. And yet, despite all of this, climbers still face the same irreversible truth. Technology can reduce risk, but it cannot eliminate human limits. Many within the climbing community now agree that the most important decisions on Everest are made long before anyone reaches the death zone. Turnaround times, strict summit cutoffs, clear agreements about when a climb ends, no debate, no negotiation. These rules exist precisely because, once a climber is in trouble above 8,000 meters, it is usually already too late. Veteran guides often say that abandonment is rarely a single choice. It is the final link in a long chain. A team pushes a little later than planned. Someone ignores early signs of fatigue. Weather shifts slightly faster than expected. Oxygen consumption rises. By the time a climber collapses, the margin for rescue has already vanished. Commercial guiding has complicated this reality. Clients invest years of training and tens of thousands of dollars. The pressure to summit, especially on narrow weather windows, can be intense. Guides and Sherpas find themselves balancing safety against expectations, knowing that a delayed descent can cascade into disaster for everyone. After the 1996 tragedy, many operators rewrote their protocols. But Everest continues to attract climbers with varying levels of experience, fitness, and judgment. Crowding on summit days compresses time and space, turning the upper mountain into a slow-moving line of exhausted bodies. In those conditions, even stopping to assess someone properly can be dangerous. Sherpa climbers have increasingly pushed back against unsafe practices. Some now refuse to carry extra loads above certain altitudes. Others insist on earlier turnarounds, regardless of client pressure. This shift is not weakness. It is survival wisdom hard-earned through loss. Still, the ethical tension remains. If you encounter someone struggling near the summit, do you attempt to help knowing it may cost your own life? Or do you keep moving, trusting that earlier decisions, your own and others, have already narrowed the outcome? Everest offers no moral clarity, only consequences. What unsettles many survivors is not just what they did, but how quickly the mountain stripped away the illusion of control. At sea level, morality feels stable. On Everest, it becomes situational, fragile, dependent on oxygen levels and remaining strength. Some climbers emerge from this understanding with humility, others with anger, a few with deep regret. But nearly all agree on one point: judging these moments from afar misses the truth. The death zone is not a courtroom. It is an environment where the body is failing, the mind is compromised, and the mountain dictates terms. Everest does not ask climbers to be heroes. It asks them to be honest about time, about limits, and about the cost of ignoring both. And those who survive often carry a quieter mission forward, to speak less about summits and more about decisions, the ones that matter long before tragedy becomes visible. Because on Everest, survival is not decided at the top. It is decided by what you are willing to give up before you ever get there. Everest has a way of stripping stories down to what truly matters. When the summit fades into memory, when the headlines move on, what remains is a single, unsettling truth. In the death zone, there are moments when no choice is clean, and no outcome feels like a victory. The climbers who walk past a dying teammate do not forget that moment. They carry it into ordinary life, into quiet mornings, crowded rooms, and conversations that feel suddenly fragile. Not because they are haunted by guilt alone, but because Everest showed them something most people never have to face. That morality, like oxygen, has limits. This does not mean compassion disappears. It means compassion collides with reality. Everest teaches that heroism is not always about pushing forward, and sacrifice is not always noble. Sometimes the bravest decision is turning around early. Sometimes it is enforcing a limit no one wants to hear. And sometimes, heartbreakingly, it is continuing downward when staying would only add another life to the mountain. Sherpa climbers understand this lesson deeply. Their strength lies not just in endurance, but in judgment forged by experience. They know that survival is not selfish, it is responsibility. To themselves, to their families, to the people who might depend on them tomorrow. In the end, Everest does not judge. It does not reward intention or punish hesitation. It simply reveals the cost of ignoring what the human body cannot overcome. There is a reason one sentence has endured across generations of climbers, guides, and survivors. On Everest, reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause rather than cheer, that is where its value lies. This is what Ben Stories exists to explore. Not the glory at the top, but the truths uncovered on the way down. Because the real legacy of Everest is not who stood on the summit. It's who understood when to walk away and lived to carry that lesson home.